In 1971, British Leyland discontinued the Morris Oxford Series 6. It had been in production at Cowley for 4 years in that final form, and by the commercial logic that governed British car manufacturing in the early 1970s, it had served its purpose and been superseded. The tooling was no longer needed. The model name was quietly retired. A large saloon of modest distinction passed out of the British market without ceremony, joining the lengthening list of nameplates that the reorganizations of the late 1960s had made redundant. In Gurugram, in the state of Haryana, the car continued in production until 2014. 43 further years. A design frozen at the point of its British discontinuation, built with progressively indigenized components, sold in a market that had no reason to want anything different, driven by taxi operators and government fleets and private families across a subcontinent whose relationship with the car would become one of the more extraordinary stories in the global automotive industry. The car was the Hindustan ambassador, and the ambassador's story, which is also, inescapably, the Morris Oxford story, is one of the most unusual second lives that any British car has ever lived. Understanding how this happened requires understanding something specific about why the Morris Oxford was chosen in the first place, and what India's industrial conditions in the late 1950s made possible, and what they made necessary. There is a decision, made in New Delhi and in Cowley simultaneously, that set everything in motion. It is not the decision you might expect, and the reasoning behind it tells you something about the gap between what a car is and what a car can become in the right circumstances. The Morris Oxford in Britain, what the car actually was. The Morris Oxford that went to India was the Series 3, introduced in 1956. To understand what that meant, you need a brief account of what the Oxford had been before it, and the account is not long, because the Oxford's British history, while respectable, was never spectacular. The Oxford name had been attached to Morris products since the 1930s, and the post-war continuation of it placed a series of medium saloons in the BMC range, between the minor at the bottom and the larger six-cylinder cars toward the top. The Oxford occupied the space that every mainstream manufacturer in Britain was competing for in the 1950s. The medium family saloon, the car for the household that had outgrown a minor and could not yet justify a Wolseley or a Riley. It shared its platform and its B-series engine with the Austin Cambridge across the road at Longbridge, the product of the badge engineering philosophy that BMC pursued with a thoroughness that gave the company economic efficiency and cost it a certain amount of brand integrity. The Series 3 Oxford of 1956 was, in British terms, a thoroughly competent car. The 1489cc B-series four-cylinder engine produced approximately 50 brake horsepower in the form that British buyers received it adequate for a car of just under a ton, comfortable at the speeds that Britain's roads in the mid-1950s required, economical enough to make the fuel bills manageable in an era when the Suez Crisis was actively reminding the British public that petrol was not guaranteed to be either cheap or available. The Farina-influenced body styling that arrived with the Series V in 1960 gave the later British Oxfords a more contemporary appearance, but the Series 3 that India chose had already established itself as solid, reliable, and proportioned for dignity rather than fashion. What the Oxford was not, in British terms, was remarkable. It sold steadily. It was used extensively as a taxi and by local authority fleets, a fact that tells you precisely what its owners thought of its reliability and running costs. It was outperformed in handling by the contemporaries that Isagonis had influenced, and in engine refinement by the cars that had access to better development resources. It was, in the plainest summary, exactly what BMC needed it to be, a dependable, profitable product for the middle of the market, and it was no more than that. That absence of excess ambition was, in ways that nobody at Cowley anticipated in 1956, exactly the quality that India needed. Hindustan Motors, the ambassador, and what India required. Hindustan Motors had been manufacturing vehicles in India since 1942, beginning under wartime conditions with assembly operations at Port Oka in Gujarat before relocating to Uttarpara in West Bengal. By the mid-1950s, the company was operating under the industrial policy of independent India's first decade, a policy that was, in its essentials, skeptical of imports, protective of domestic industry, and committed to the development of manufacturing capacity as a component of national self-sufficiency. The government of Jawaharlal Nehru had imposed import restrictions on finished vehicles that made the continued importation of British cars in assembled form economically unviable for any volume operation. What India's industrial policy permitted, indeed, what it encouraged was the local manufacture of vehicles under license, with an expectation of progressively increasing the indigenous content of each vehicle until the dependence on imported components had been substantially reduced. This was not a policy unique to India in the post-war period. It was the standard approach of developing economies, attempting to build an industrial base without simply purchasing it from abroad. But it shaped the choice that Hindustan Motors made with a directness that left the outcome almost overdetermined. The Morris Oxford Series 3 was selected because its engineering was within the manufacturing capability that Hindustan Motors could develop, because its dimensions and specification suited the requirements of the Indian market as it was then understood, and because BMC was willing to enter the license arrangement on terms that made the economics work for both parties. The car that went into production at Uttarpara in 1958, initially with a high proportion of imported components, progressively replaced over subsequent years with parts produced in India, was designated the Hindustan Ambassador Mark I. The name was a deliberate statement of the car's intended social position in the Indian market, not a humble conveyance, but something that carried associations of official dignity and purpose. The process of indigenization that followed the initial launch was not rapid, and its pace was determined as much by India's industrial capacity at each stage as by any planned schedule. Machining facilities for engine components, pressed steel capacity for body panels, the ancillary industries that supply the dozens of minor components that constitute a complete car, these took time to develop in a country whose manufacturing sector was building itself essentially from scratch in the years after independence. Hindustan Motors managed this process with a patience that reflected the Indian industrial policy's longer time horizon. The objective was not the next model cycle, but the next decade, and decisions were made accordingly. By the 1970s, the Ambassador's indigenous content had reached a level that made the car genuinely Indian in its manufacture, whatever its British origins in design. Those associations proved remarkably durable. The Ambassador's adoption by India's government fleet as the vehicle of choice for senior civil servants, for ministerial transport, for the visible apparatus of administration in a country where the state's physical presence was in many contexts the most significant institution in daily life, gave the car a status that transcended its specification, almost immediately. An ambassador in government, white, with the appropriate flags or insignia, was not merely a car, it was the state, moving through the street. That association, once established, proved almost impossible to dislodge, and it gave the ambassador a commercial durability that no purely market-based assessment of the car's specification would have predicted. 57 years, how the Ambassador outlasted everything. The Ambassador remained in production, in forms recognizably derived from the 1956 Oxford, from 1958 until 2000, and 57 years, which is a production run that has few parallels in the global automotive industry at any level of the market. The Volkswagen Beetle, which is usually cited as the definitive example of a single design sustained across an improbable span of time, ran in German production from 1945 to 1978. The Ambassador exceeded that. The Citroën 2CV, which this series has examined, ran 42 years. The Ambassador exceeded that too. What sustained it was not inertia, though inertia played its part. It was a combination of factors specific to the Indian market that interacted with the Ambassador's particular qualities in ways that kept it commercially viable long after any rational external assessment might have concluded otherwise. The taxi industry was the most significant of these factors. In Kolkata especially, the Ambassador had become so thoroughly identified with the city's taxi fleet that displacing it required not merely a better product, but a better product at a price that the economics of taxi operation in India could absorb, a condition that proved difficult to meet for decades because the Ambassador's production costs, tooling amortized across 60 years of manufacture, were extraordinarily low by the standards of any competitor attempting to enter the market with a newer design. The Kolkata Ambassador taxi deserves a moment of specific attention because it became something that few vehicles in any market achieve, a vehicle so identified with a city that the two became, in the popular imagination, inseparable. The yellow Ambassador of Kolkata was not merely transport. It was part of the visual grammar of the city, as much an element of what Kolkata looked and felt like as the trams on Esplanade or the Howrah Bridge seen from the river. Visitors arriving for the first time who had looked at photographs beforehand knew what to expect from the street level, and the Ambassador, parked 3 deep at every rank, was part of what they expected. The car had become a symbol before many of its drivers were born. Hindustan Motors updated the Ambassador continuously within the constraints of its frozen body design. The original 1489cc B-Series engine was joined over the years by a 1817cc diesel unit, the Isuzu-derived engine, that gave the Ambassador genuine taxi economics, and that became the preferred specification for commercial operators and later by a more modern petrol unit. The interior evolved through successive marque designations. Equipment levels that were adequate for 1958 India were progressively updated for the expectations of successive Indian generations. The car that a Kolkata taxi driver operated in 2005 was not the car that had left Uttarpara in 1960, despite wearing a body of recognizably identical lineage. The cultural embedding of the Ambassador in Indian life reached a point that no commercial calculation fully explains. It appeared in Indian cinema across 5 decades. It became the subject of a particular kind of nostalgic affection that Indians living outside India carried with them as a symbol of a certain version of home. Politicians who wanted to signal authenticity were photographed with ambassadors. Designers who wanted to signal India referenced the Ambassador's silhouette. The car became a cultural object of a kind that its British origins gave no indication it was capable of becoming, and that the Morris Oxford's own history in Britain, solid, dependable, unmemorable, offered no preparation for. Production finally ended in May of 2014, when Hindustan Motors suspended manufacturing operations at the Uttarpara plant, citing falling demand and accumulated losses. The announcement was received in India with a public response that the Morris Oxford's British discontinuation in 1971 had not produced editorials, tributes, a genuine sense of cultural loss that reflected the Ambassador's status as something more than a vehicle. The last Ambassador was not merely the end of a production run. For a significant number of Indians, it was the end of something that had been present in their lives, in one form or another, for as long as they could remember. The Oxford in the classic market, and the Ambassador's second conversation. The Morris Oxford in its British forms occupies a quiet corner of the classic car market that rewards the buyer who approaches it without the assumptions that more celebrated contemporaries attract. The Farina-bodied Series V and Series V, which represent the car's most visually resolved British form, are undervalued relative to their quality and their historical interest, products of the Italian styling influence that Giorgio Giugiaro's mentor, Battista Pininfarina, brought to several BMC models in the late 1950s, and that gave the Oxford a cleanliness of line that its domestic critics underestimated at the time, and that the classic market has been slowly correcting. The earlier Series 3, the body that went to India, is of specific interest to buyers who understand the Ambassador connection and who want the closest available British equivalent to what Hindustan Motors produced across 5 decades. Genuine, well-preserved Series 3 Oxfords are uncommon in the British market, having been used primarily as working transport by their original owners and surviving accordingly. A sound example with documented history offers a directness of connection to one of automotive history's more unusual stories that no amount of later series ownership quite replicates. The B-series engine that powers all British Oxfords is among the most thoroughly understood and best supported classic British engines in existence, the consequence of its use across the entire BMC range for decades, which has produced a parts supply situation and a community of knowledge that makes the Oxford's mechanical maintenance as straightforward as classic car ownership gets. The corrosion that accumulates in the sills, the floor, and the boot floor of any Oxford that has spent its life in the British climate is the primary concern on any purchase. The mechanical components, by contrast, are robust and well documented. The Ambassador, for its part, has developed its own collector community in India, where examples are preserved with the kind of affection that surrounds objects of genuine cultural significance, and among the diaspora communities in Britain, North America, and Australia for whom the car carries the specific emotional weight of childhood and of a particular version of home. An Ambassador in Britain today is a rare thing, an object of curiosity and warmth that no purely automotive assessment accounts for. Its presence in the classic car world is cultural as much as mechanical, and the conversations it generates at shows and on roads are not the conversations that a Morris Oxford generates, because the Ambassador, unlike the Oxford, carries 57 years of a different country's history in its bodywork. The Morris Oxford was discontinued in Britain in 1971 because British Leyland had other priorities, because the market had moved, and because nobody at Cowley had reason to think the decision was complicated. It was the end of a medium saloon's run in a changing market, the kind of decision that manufacturers make dozens of times across a generation, without any of them producing the kind of story we are discussing here. What nobody at Cowley knew, or thought to ask, was what the car had become in Uttarpara. They had licensed a design, they had received their royalties, they had moved on. That is the ordinary rhythm of a technology transfer arrangement, and there was no particular reason in 1971 to look back at what the license had produced in India and understand it as something more than a commercial transaction that had run its course. But what it had produced, in 57 years of uninterrupted manufacture, was something that no British car had produced in Britain, a vehicle so thoroughly embedded in the daily life of a country that the announcement of its end was treated as a national event, not by the automotive press, by the general public, by people who had no particular interest in cars as objects, but who understood that the Ambassador had been present in their lives in the way that certain things become inseparable from the texture of experience itself. The Morris Oxford deserved better in Britain than it received. It was a good car that was never quite celebrated, never quite defended, never quite allowed the institutional loyalty that would have kept its name alive after the badge was retired. The Ambassador, which was the same car in a different country, received everything that the Oxford did not: time, loyalty, cultural embedding, and eventually the kind of mourning that only comes when something genuinely irreplaceable is lost. The car was the same. The reception was entirely different. That difference says something about Britain's relationship with its own automotive history that we have not, as an industry or a culture, finished accounting for. Now I want to hear from you. Did you encounter an Ambassador in India, or did someone in your family own one? Do you remember it from a particular journey, a particular city, a particular version of a place that has since changed? Or did you come to this story from the British side as an Oxford owner, or as someone who simply finds it remarkable that a BMC saloon from Cowley outlasted, in a different country, almost everything that Britain's motor industry subsequently built? Leave it in the comments. The Oxford story and the Ambassador's story are the same story told from two different directions, and both directions deserve to be heard. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription are appreciated. Thank you for watching.